So Jean-Paul Sartre, one of my earliest philosophers that I spent time reading, has this phrase that I quite like. And what he said is, if you're lonely when you're alone, you're in bad company. Interesting kind of existential thought. By equal measure though, if you're blocked when you're writing, you're probably doing the wrong thing. Like, you're probably not doing this the right way.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Grad Coach podcast. My name is Derek, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ethar, one of our trusty coaches, and we're going to be talking about writer's block, specifically in the context of a dissertation or thesis or any sort of similar academic research project. If you are working on a dissertation or a thesis, be sure to grab a copy of our free dissertation template, which is a great way to get yourself unstuck and to fast track your writing. You can find the link to that below this video. And with that out of the way, let's get this party started. Dr. E, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
So today we're talking writer's block, or specifically writer's block for dissertation writers, thesis writers. You ready for this, Dr. E? You feeling pumped, feeling ready to drop some actionable points on our dear students?
Obviously, first and foremost, I don't know if I like the implication that there could be a time when I'm not ready. You met me enough times. You know I'm ready. That's number one. Number two, this whole writer's block thing has got me in a mood. So when we get into this, I don't know, man. Like, there's going to be a couple gems. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to drop the philosophical gem. That's going to happen. But yeah, if I start wilding out on a couple of people and I lose my mind a little bit on your whole writer's block thing, don't blame me. You're the one that's stuck. We'll figure this out.
Action point number one is to stop idealizing what good looks like. And I think there's an emphasis there on good. We're not perfect because we covered perfectionism in the last episode, but this is stop idealizing what good looks like. Dr. E, what's this about?
Let's start philosophically. Now that you brought up the philosophical gems, we'll start with a little bit of philosophy. So Jean-Paul Sartre, one of my earliest philosophers that I spent time reading, has this phrase that I quite like. And what he said is, if you're lonely when you're alone, you're in bad company. Interesting kind of existential thought. By equal measure though, if you're blocked when you're writing, you're probably doing the wrong thing. Like, you're probably not doing this the right way. Let me explain. Let me break down what I mean by this. This is the bad faith of writer's block, right? The illusion of being blocked when you're writing, or the disingenuousness of that condition, what you find yourself in. And it's what we actually mean by idealizing the good. And in that sense, what I'm talking about here is this sense of, you take your work and then you abstract it and you present it to yourself as though what you're doing is never going to be good enough. What it has to be is, as you mentioned a moment ago, perfect. It has to be ideal. It has to be the right kind of good. It has to be the right kind of work that you're doing. And in abstracting this thing, or abstracting your goal, whether that's finishing the essay or finishing the chapter that you're on, or finishing the paper that you're writing, or even the section of the paper that you're writing, whatever it might happen to be. But by abstracting this and idealizing it into the most perfect, almost platonic form, see, two kinds of philosophy in my first bit, but into its platonic form, you render it almost metaphysical, and by definition, therefore, impossible to achieve. Look, let me just say this as a side note before I explain this any further. As an academic, which is what we're all theoretically trying to be in these pieces of work, our commitment is to a single virtue. And that virtue is the virtue of truth. What I mean by truth is transparency and accuracy, not good, whether or not my work is good, or whether or not my work is bad, or whether or not my work is right, or whether or not my work is perfect, as value judgments. Those things are kind of irrelevant to the point. The point that we're trying to arrive at is whether or not my work is truthful, whether or not what I've done is transparent, and whether or not what I've done is accurate. These are the only criteria that we need to assess our work by, particularly as scientific academics, or when you're working within the sciences, whatever form or version of the sciences you're working on. That has to be your goal. That has to be your focus, and making sure that everything that you're doing is sticking to that it's always transparent and it's always accurate, regardless of whether or not it's always good or bad or perfect or ideal or whatever else it might happen to be. So what that means, in short, is identify the very next step, the most immediate next step you need to take, whether that's perfecting the next sentence, or correcting the next paragraph, or quoting the next source, or whatever it is that you're doing in the very next most immediate step, and then focus on taking just that. That's the only thing you need to worry about.
It kind of makes me think of, with all the hype around AI models and generative technology at the moment, one of the concepts that underlies all of that is that these models are predicting the next word, predicting the next word, predicting the next word. And that sounds really basic, and to a certain degree it is, but we can see what the results of that are, some pretty impressive content. And so I think it's really just, excuse my little side quest there, but I think it's really, really important to emphasize this thing of just focus on the next steps. Stop blowing up this task into some huge, unachievable, inspiring piece of prose that you think you need to write. If you want to bring yourself back down to reality, go have a look at some past dissertations from students that undertook the same program. Sure, the content might be a little bit over your head if it's not your area of expertise, but these are not amazing, inspiring, jaw-dropping pieces of writing. As Dr. E said, this is just about asking a question and then going and systematically and rigorously undertaking the necessary work to find the answer, or to at least get clarity towards an answer, and then reporting on that. And so I guess the point that we're really trying to make here is that if you find yourself stuck, if you find yourself in a writer's block situation, chances are your idea of what you need to create is not entirely accurate, and that specifically that it is way bigger in your mind than it is in reality. And so you need to just bring yourself back down to earth and then focus on just next steps, next steps, next steps. You're not trying to create, as we so often say on this podcast, you're not trying to create some revolutionary piece of new knowledge. You're not trying to win a Nobel Prize. You're just reporting on the findings of your research. And if you can remember that, it just lowers the stakes. It just kind of allows you to go, okay, all I need to do is communicate what I have found. And there you are. Then you're in a space where you can go, okay, cool. So what did I find? How do I report on these things? And then you just work through it draft by draft by draft. Don't try to write it perfectly the first time, just draft by draft by draft.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, look, in looking at all of those past papers and looking at the other examples of what people have done, there are two things that you really ought to be noticing. The first of those two things that you want to notice is the variations in those papers. That is to say, there are no two that are exactly the same, and there are no two that are without error or without flaw. There are going to be flaws within them. There are going to be sentences that you feel like could have been written better. There are going to be arguments that you feel like could have been presented better. There are going to be sections that you feel like could have had more evidence in them, or whatever else is. I mean, all of these papers that are published and completed are not perfect. They're not flawless. That's the first thing you want to pay attention to. But the second thing that you want to pay attention to, the important point, the one that I think you're getting at here, is this idea that there is a preset structure to these things. I mean, in scientific papers, as you said, it's not poetry. We're not talking about writing prose that's going to fundamentally change the way everybody looks at the world. That's not what we're talking about. It's a scientific paper, which means there's already a preset path for composition. The point is that you identify the next step, you take that next step, safe in the knowledge that you're going to eventually come back and go through the editing, refinements and improvements that are necessary as its own independent task, not as something that you need to do all in one go. So focus on the next thing, knock that out, and then move on to the one after that.
I think something that we touched on here, but it's just really worth pressing a little bit harder on, is the idea of perfectionism. And I think most students will not admit that they're aiming for perfectionism. And that's just because in your own mind, you don't necessarily think of it that way. You just think of it as good. You just think of it as, well, I want to do the right thing, create a good piece of work. But perfectionism is really the enemy of progress. And you really need to just reframe this thing in your mind. Chances are, if you're stuck with writer's block, you are trying to be too much of a perfectionist. And so we just did a podcast on that last week, so be sure to go check that out. As Dr. E said, we've got templates. This is a pretty formulaic thing, a dissertation or thesis. It's a pretty standardized structure. There can be some variations between disciplines, but fundamentally the process of asking a question and then systematically going and answering it and reporting on those findings is much the same. And so be sure to check out those templates. You can find the link to that in the description. All right, so on to our second point, our second action point for those of you who are feeling a little bit stuck with writer's block, and that is to note-take your way into writing. Dr. E, these are your words. What on earth do you mean, note-take your way into writing?
All right, so just so you know, it's not all metaphysics and phenomenology and complex philosophies. There are a couple of practical steps here that express those principles. Notice, see, I don't think the practical steps are separate from the philosophy, but we can get into that's a separate conversation later. The point is, I understand that writing can be a daunting task, no matter how you want to slice this, however you want to look at this, even if there are templates, even if this stuff is predictable, even if it is generic and formulaic, this can be a daunting process and it can be a tricky thing to do. I completely understand that. It's that blank page that you're staring at, that blinking cursor that's kind of waiting for you to do something, the expectations implied by this yawning chasm of an empty Word document. Like, I get it. Like, I get how difficult this must be. So, there's a way around this. Why write? Don't. Edit. Instead of writing your way through the piece of paper, edit your way through the piece of paper. And what do I mean by this? Look, ultimately, writing is just a byproduct of note-taking. That's really all it is. I mean, it's just you take a bunch of notes and eventually you produce some writing off the back of those notes. Ideally, that's what you should be doing in the first place. So take extensive notes. Rather than just taking one or two and bullet pointing a couple of things, take extensive notes. Bullet point the steps of your chapter, make suggestions for what you're going to say, where you're going to say it, work out the notes between your notes, even down to each individual sentence. So give yourself a cue for, I'm going to write this sentence here, and I'm going to write that sentence there, and I'm going to write that sentence there. But note your way through this whole thing so you're never actually writing a final sentence. And then when you've done this exhaustively, when you've done this to the nth degree, you can start editing your way into the actual chapter. So you're never actually doing anything. You're just filling in the blanks between your notes and then editing them, refining them to make them look better and better and better and better the whole way through. If you do this exhaustively, if you do this at length, and if you do this committedly, it's not so much your writing as it is that the paper should kind of just appear out of the page, that the whole essay, chapter, whatever it is that you're working on should kind of just bleed out of the page as opposed to you imposing something on top of it. It's just a nice, neat way of getting your brain around the idea that what you're trying to do is to write something, quote unquote, write something. But if that's what you're trying to do, what we want to do is get our heads around this issue. So for those that are trying to write something, and yeah, I'm air quoting writing something for those that don't see us on YouTube, you're listening to this on one of our podcast channels. If you're trying to quote unquote write something, this is a nice, neat way of getting around the daunting nature of what that means. So instead of thinking about it as composition, instead of thinking about it as writing from scratch and producing work that then has to be perfect because you're quote unquote writing, you're never writing at all. You never actually get into that in the slightest. All you're actually doing is taking extensive notes, developing your thoughts in note form, just in note form, so you can bullet point it, you can have it in half completed sentences, you can have it in indications of what it is that you're trying to do. And then when you fill those notes out, go back and fill them in again. Find out, as I said, the notes between the notes. Find out what else you can add in. Find out what things you think you're missing and make a note about those things too. And then once you've done that exhaustively, as I said previously, you can start editing your way into this. Even if that means that you're just filling in the blanks in between your notes and maybe you write a half sentence here and a half sentence there. And then you go back and edit it and clean that sentence up, or you tweak this and you improve that sentence in some particular place. That's all you ever really have to do. It's not actually writing. You're just editing and noting, or noting and editing your way into your composition and allowing the paper or the chapter or whatever it is that you're writing to appear out of the page.
Absolutely. I think so many students have the misconception of the writing being this top-down process where you've got to develop the whole narrative in your head and then get it down onto paper. And what you're proposing is really the opposite of that. It's a sort of inductive, bottom-up, letting the thoughts and the ideas emerge type process. And it's infinitely better because if you take the top-down approach, that's just like recipe for writer's block, because you're going to get stuck in that thinking space. And so you definitely want to take that bottom-up approach, let your notes just sort of cluster and just get into the process of just taking notes whenever a thought strikes you, and you can figure out where those fit in. And I think that also touches on a broader point, which is you don't need to approach this thing particularly sequentially, right? So you don't need to develop these notes and these pieces as you're working on a specific chapter. Now, obviously, you can't talk about your data findings before you go and collect the data and analyze it. But within chapters, if you're sort of at the beginning of your literature review, but there's something that you need to, or that you want to come back around to at the end of the literature review, or that might fit in somewhere, just take that note, just jot it down, and within perhaps a dirty bullet point document, you can just sort of make a little space for it over there and you can come back to it. And this does mean, obviously, that you're going to write a lot of notes and you're not necessarily going to use all of them, and that's completely okay. That's completely fine. Don't get obsessed with this idea of once I put something down onto paper, I need to use it. I don't want to lose that little gem that I wrote down there. It's better to think, and we've spoken about this many times before, it's better to think of writing as a form of thinking. It's really just thinking on paper. And so you're just allowing yourself to sort of download these thoughts that are manic and skittish and all over your headspace and probably going to disappear if you don't write them down. It's just a way to download all of that onto paper, and then you can come back to it and then you can polish it. And you really need to approach writing as this iterative process. Don't get sucked into the obsessive behavior of trying to write a perfect first draft. There's just no such thing. There's a quote from Jodi Picoult, I think, and it says, "You can always edit a bad page, but you can't edit a blank page." And that's so, so true. It's like, get it down, just get those dirty, no, I shouldn't say dirty thoughts, but get those rough thoughts down onto paper, and then work your way through that, polish those. And on that note, I'll hand back to you, Dr. E.
Who said don't get down your dirty thoughts? I mean, get them down. Maybe they shouldn't be in your head while you're writing your thesis. What are you doing right now? Like, why is your head getting distracted? Now, don't send those dirty thoughts to me. I don't need to know. But, maybe keep them in a drawer somewhere, save them for your partner. You might want to share them with somebody or your therapist. Like, we'll just see how this works out in time. But, in the first instance, just trying to filter out the thoughts and the focus. Look, I think it's interesting that you mentioned being obsessive, right? And I think there's something to this. And the method that I'm describing here, this noting and editing your way into a paper as opposed to actually writing it, ironically enough, is taken from an obsessive. That is to say, let me break this down for you. There's a philosopher called Slavoj Žižek. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with him. I know you're all just pretending to be familiar with him to make me feel better about myself, and I appreciate that. I like this kind of comforting, safe environment that we've created for ourselves. So everybody just nod like we know who these philosophers are. That's cool. But the point is, so Slavoj Žižek is this guy who himself suffers from an actual OCD. Like, he takes, pills and he sees doctors and what have you. He's actually got a serious condition. And the nature of his condition, part of the nature of his condition means that he can't actually stop writing, and he can't keep himself from not writing. He's constantly writing something. It's a reflex. It's not so much that he's got so many thoughts in his head, he needs to get them down. Very often he's been accused of self-plagiarism because he keeps repeating his thoughts over and over again. So it's not that he's recreating, but it's that there's this kind of constant swirl of ideas in his head that he has to put down somewhere. So he suffers from this extreme OCD, and the result of that is he's produced over 60 books. There are hundreds of articles in at least 2 languages, as far as I can tell, maybe 3 or 4 different languages. But the key thing here is that he too writes in this iterative format. So what he'll do is he'll note something, then he'll develop that note, and then add some more notes. Then he'll refine what he's written. Then he's going to add some more notes, and he's going to develop that, and then add some more notes, and then refine what he's written there, and then do this over and over and over and over again. So when I saw this, there was a documentary on him, and I saw him doing this and explaining this process. And what he was saying is this, that he does this partly because the nature of his condition means that he can't really get a whole book out in one go. Like, his mind won't allow him to do it. He's constantly got this urge to want to write something else and write something else and write something else. So the way he's found of coping with that is by permitting it, but in a controlled fashion. So rather than just constantly coming up with new ideas, he's writing notes about that central principle. And then as he does this, he ends up using that OCD not against itself, but to his advantage. So now I'm writing and writing and writing and writing and writing. I'm satisfying that obsessive compulsion, but what I'm doing is satisfying it in the direction of the goal that I'm trying to arrive at. And if you do this iteratively over and over and over and over again, you end up producing a final piece of work that's actually really, really, really good. So what I'm suggesting here is that you can do very much the same thing, that you go through your work. You might even go through the whole chapter or the whole section that you're looking at, maybe even the whole thesis, the whole essay, the whole whatever else, all in note form. Just you're noting out the ideas in pieces. And then you go back and do it all again from beginning to end. And you look at chapter 1 and say, okay, what else could I have added here in notes? And then add those notes in. And then you do the chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and so on and so forth. And then you do the whole paper and go back and do it all over again. And you're constantly just adding more and more and more layers of note taking to this document, refining the thoughts further and further as you go along. And you're never actually writing anything, quote unquote, writing anything. You're just developing and then ultimately editing your thoughts in a manner that's coherent and directed towards what that goal was in the first place. So it's not the idealism or the idealizing of the goal, the idealizing of the paper. It's the understanding that that paper is going to produce itself. All I needed to do was to get the thoughts that are surrounding or orbiting that paper, or orbiting that central principle down onto a page, organize them accordingly, edit them so that they seem clean and legible, and that's it. I'm basically there.
I think at a practical or tactical level, it's useful to keep in mind that not only can you take written notes or even handwritten notes, but we live in a time now where we have all of these tools available in terms of automatic transcription and AI-based transcription. And so you can just be taking voice notes. These things, as we've spoken about so many times on the podcast, shower thoughts, random little pearls of wisdom that float into your mind at times that you would least expect. You don't need to be don't think of this note-taking process as like, oh, now I need to sit down and take notes and collect my thoughts. No, it can happen at any point in time. And so keep in mind that you can make use of technology to just capture the stuff in multiple formats. And related to that, some people find it really useful to get their thoughts down, not necessarily in forms of textual notes or paragraphs, but in the form of mind maps and those sort of visual connections between different concepts. I remember when I was writing or busy working through my dissertation, I had this massive whiteboard in my office. It was like 2 or 3 meters by 2 meters. It was massive. And I was just taking the pen or the marker to this whiteboard all the time as I was reading literature. I was going like, okay, that's interesting. I have no idea how it might fit into this thing, but it does connect to that other thing that I read. And so for me, visually, it's really useful to do this. So keep those things in mind. Keep in mind that you can take notes in multiple formats. You can just record your voice and then get that transcribed into text, which might be able to go verbatim into your dissertation. And it's also, from a more conceptual and relational perspective, it's really useful for some people at least to visualize these things with mind maps, whiteboards, or again, just back of the napkin type drawings. These things can be really, really useful.
I'll tell you this much. I did exactly the same thing when I was doing my master's, when I did my bachelor's, when I did my PhD. It was very much the same thing. I can't say that I had a 2x3 foot whiteboard in my room, but I did have a wall. I had a pencil on the wall. I mean, that wall looked like I had a bunch of graffiti on it. Nobody could tell what I was talking about because it was philosophy. Damn it, still nobody could tell what I'm talking about. It's published in a book and nobody knows what I'm talking about, but that's not the point. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I did exactly the same thing, just as a means and a method of getting the thoughts out and getting them visually presented somewhere so that I've got a reference point for them, so I don't have to kind of like maintain that reference point in my mind. So it's not as though you have to, on top of understanding what it is that you're trying to understand and then coming up with a composition that you want to create, then also retain the thoughts that you're saving for later somewhere in the back of your head, and then do all of those things at the same time. You're just asking yourself to do way too much all at once, and then invariably, of course, you get stuck and it doesn't work and you lose track of everything, and then it gets difficult to do. And it's like, well, you could have just written it down somewhere. Like, there's no reason why you had to do this to yourself. Listen, you've said this twice now, I feel like it's worth mentioning. There's a big difference between AI and AI. And here's what I mean by these things. There's artificial intelligence and then there's actual intelligence. Like, you could lean on the artificial intelligence all day long, but please, can we not forget, we are actually intelligent. Somebody came up with this. We came up with the artificial intelligence. We outdo it. All right. So yes, use it, but use it safe in the knowledge that you're the intelligence leading it, not the other way around. Like, I feel like this is just an important point to mention.
All right. So far we've said, 1, you need to stop idealizing your view of what good looks like. And 2, that you need to edit your way into writing. And that brings us to our third and final, or last but not least, action point in terms of beating writer's block. And that is to get into the right space mentally and physically. This sounds rather traditional, Dr. E. What do we mean? What's your spin on this?
All right, let's get philosophical again. You hit me with the whole tradition. Let's make this funky and interesting. All right, let's make this real philosophically funky. And I say funky with a PH, not an F. Don't get it twisted. It's philosophically funky, okay? You know what's wrong with the mind-body problem? The illusion of duality, okay? It's not a problem. That's what's wrong with the mind-body problem. It's not a problem. Let me explain what I mean by this. It's just silly to think that your mind functions independently of your environment. And all too often, your position, and by your position, I mean the combination of your posture and your location, all too often are not actually conducive to composition. What do I mean by this? Look, ideally, you would have a dedicated work space. That's to say, a place from which you do nothing but work. So ideally, you wouldn't be trying to write from bed. You wouldn't be trying to write from the couch. If you have a desk, or if you have access to a desk, even in that instance, sit up straight. have the screen at eye level, or actually a little bit above eye level, so that your eyes aren't drooping and looking down, and it's going to encourage your sleepy thoughts. So what you don't want to do is be looking down all the time at a screen that's kind of blaring light at you, and then you start feeling tired and sleepy invariably. But if you're looking at eye level or looking slightly upwards, beyond that point, it's going to raise that eyesight or raise your eye line, and that's going to incline you to stay awake. It's little simple tricks like this which make a massive difference. And then even when you do all of these things, so even if you do have a dedicated workspace and you're not trying to finish your composition from bed or from the couch or wherever else it might happen to be, and you're doing it relatively well, you're going to get stuck, because that's the nature of composition. That's just the way this works. It's just invariably at some point or another, you're going to get stuck. And when you do get stuck, inevitably, once again, change the environment. Go and change the stimuli, because your brain is receiving stimulation from the environment that it's in. So change the environment and stimulate your brain differently. Go for a walk. In fact, when you go for the walk, take your thoughts with you. Why are you leaving them at home at the desk? Take them with you. Shoot, when you're walking, you might even take your notes with you, and even, wait for it, in paper and pen form even. Ooh, how exciting. Look, this is exactly my whole master's degree. Let me be really honest about this, just so you know I'm not giving you kind of advice that I don't do myself. My entire master's degree was completed on a hillside overlooking the ocean on the south coast of England. Like that's where I did the entire thing. What I would do is go for a walk. I'd sit down. I know it's starting to sound like a little bit of an anime thing. Like I feel like there should be
This is such a philosopher thing to do. You're such a stereotype right now.
Yeah, but I make it look good, bro. Like, come on now with the bald head of the bit. Stop it. But the point is true, no. But it's exactly what it was, bro. I feel like it's just some kind of a clip from an anime cartoon with somebody. Like I don't know. There should be like hair flowing in the wind, but the baldness just doesn't help. The point is, I used to genuinely go onto this hillside. I take all of my notes with me. I take all of my work with me. I have a pen and a stack of papers, and then I just sit there while I'm sat on the hillside writing out my notes, trying to fill in the blanks, figuring out what I'm going to do next, what this next chapter is going to look like, and what's going to go into it, and what I'm going to quote, and where I'm going to quote them, and why, and how to break down this point from this particular philosopher, or that point from that other philosopher, or whatever it might happen to be. I did all of that on the hillside. And then at the end of the day, when it got a little bit too dark, or it got a little bit English, meaning it got cold, but when it got a little bit English, I would take my notes back with me, go back home, turn on the heating, because we're in England, but I'd turn on the heating and then just type all of that stuff up. And it's not me writing anymore. I'm just typing up the notes that I took throughout the course of that day. And now that I've changed the environment, it looks like I'm just in the second phase of that working process. So I fooled myself into thinking that I'm doing something where I'm not actually doing. I could have done the entire thing just being sat down the whole time, but I understand that in order to elicit the energy necessary, or in order to get my brain in gear, I had to change the environment, so I'm not just staring at that same blank wall all day long. Look, there's a phrase, or the saying that I've heard on numerous previous occasions. I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but if anybody knows, leave it in the comments. Just let me know. But the point is that the phrase says you can only think as far as you can see. So don't be surprised if you just sat there staring at a wall day long that your thoughts get stuck at a certain point. I mean, it's kind of predictable. You just sat here with a wall 2 feet in front of you thinking, why can't I come up with the ideas? Go for a walk. Look outside. Look at the ocean. Look at the skyline. Open the space for your thinking and see how much further it takes you.
I heard an anecdote that Maya Angelou used to rent a hotel room just for writing, just as a way to break away. So I guess that's really testimony to this point. But in the absence of the budget for renting hotel rooms, there's always Starbucks, there's always your local coffee shop, there's always somewhere that you can go and be able to get some work done. And just a change of environment, just to change that scenery, it's extremely beneficial. It really kicks you into a different gear. And beyond a different place to work, it's also just useful to take that time to go for a walk, perhaps, take a step away from your screen. We've spoken about this previously. You don't need to feel guilty for not staring at your screen for whatever 8, 12, 16 hours a day. You can and should take that time out. If you're down for running or down for cycling or down for whatever exercise, don't feel guilty about doing that stuff. It's not like your brain just switches off and you stop thinking about your dissertation or your research. In fact, that's the perfect opportunity for your brain to start approaching the problem from different angles. And that is where you're most likely to get some inspiration, when you're actually not tackling the problem head on. And so make sure that you allow yourself to have these things that might feel like luxuries, these changes of locations, these changes of activities. Allow yourself to do those things knowing that they are actually some of the most productive things that you can do.
100%. Look, let me just say this. If y'all have made it this far, you stuck with the podcast this far. First and foremost, thank you. Second of all, you should have been doing that. Like, don't praise yourself too much. Like, I'm helping you out, all right? You should be here for the whole podcast. But in any case, now that you've made it this far, let me give you a little treat, a little story time, okay? There's just a little kind of background information that I feel like might loop us back around to where we started off with in the bad faith of writer's block and how most of this is really an illusion in your own head. There's a guy by the name of Reuben Hurricane Carter. Reuben Hurricane Carter was a middleweight boxer from the 1960s, right? He had 40 fights, 27 wins, 19 by knockout. He was wrongfully arrested and convicted of a triple homicide in 1966 and spent almost 20 years in prison. A lot of this in isolation. And while he was there, he immersed himself in his condition. He sunk into his situation and he refused to see anybody for almost the first 10 years of the entire time that he was in prison. He ended up divorcing his wife because on his insistence, she shouldn't come and visit him anymore because he was trying to adjust himself to the reality of where he was, and committed himself to the study of religion, to the study of literature, to the study of philosophy, the study of theology, and wrote a whole book whilst in prison. I say all of this to say that the writer's block that you think that you bumped into is ultimately just your refusal to accept the fact of imperfection. It's that. That's what we're describing here. And as soon as you start accepting the facts of imperfection and commit yourself to addressing the most immediate task in front of you, the next step in whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing, you'll find that perfection will begin to disclose itself to you. And that block that was getting in the way ends up becoming the seat from which you do your best thinking. So what I'm saying is, pick up your pen, and yeah, I said pen. Pick up a piece of paper and start noting down your ideas. Start noting down your thoughts. Begin at the very, very next step. Begin at the very next thing that you need to do. Commit yourself to the situation that you're in. Accept the necessity of imperfection in order for you to produce the work that you're looking for, and begin. Nothing else is going to matter.
Said like a true philosopher, sitting in the English hillsides, countrysides, wherever it is that you sit and have your shower thoughts. But so true, Dr. E, as always, this has been very insightful. Thank you for your time.
A little bit like work, but just don't think you got to wait another week for a podcast. You know, you can find me at Grad Coach and, look us up. I see you there.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Grad Coach podcast. Remember, you can get access to our free tried and tested dissertation template, as well as loads of other free resources over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description below this video. And if you did enjoy this video, which I hope you did, if you're this far down the rabbit hole, please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you'll want to watch this video next. I'll see you there.